Hi, I'm Tom Ryle from the Department of Fish and Wildlife. It's the end of September and we just wrapped up our early archery elk and deer seasons. So what I wanted to do today is take a few minutes and step through the rest of the fall, maybe take a step back and look at where we are today in terms of what animals might be doing, the weather factors, and then look at the months ahead and try to break that down for you and hopefully give you some tips and tactics that you can take to the field and help you fill those tags this fall. We've got a lot to cover. Welcome your questions and comments. Let's get started. All right, let's break down some of the deer tactics that you might want to try this fall. So when you look at the spring that we had, it was really wet. It was a long, wet spring that kind of led into summer, and then like a light switch, we started getting really warm weather. That stayed consistent all the way through. Last night, we had a nice night of rain for the first time in a few months. So what does that mean to deer? Now, I'm in Western Washington, and obviously Washington has a lot of different habitats that you can hunt deer in. But all of these principles apply. So when you have a wet spring, that's a good thing for animals, especially big game, because it provides feed, much longer into the summer. And then when you get into summer, then things start to dry up, and now food becomes a primary need for these animals. You've got food, shelter, water, or food, cover, and water are the three main principles that you want to think about. So unless there's a wildfire displacing animals, cover is going to be where it is, right, in the habitats that you hunt. It's typically brush, big trees, mature stands of timber, mixed forests, etc. So in terms of hunting tactics, I would be looking at north-facing slopes. I would be looking at areas that have water sources, whether it's a spring or an established river or stream drainage. And I would be really focusing on feed. Where are those animals going to be feeding? Where are they likely bedding? And then what path are they taking between those two spots? And that's really what you're trying to do to discern a hunting strategy, is figure out where those deer want to be to feed, where they want to be to bed, and then how do they get between those two spots. Glassing is always a great option in open country, because if you can allow your eyes to pick apart a ridge line or a hillside, that's going to save your legs, save your energy, and allow you to really just conserve your own energy and not cover miles that you don't need to cover. Okay, so in addition to glassing, one thing I do a lot of is called in-season scouting, and it's just like it sounds. You're scouting during the season. So there's a lot of hunters that will hunt early morning, and around 9:30, 10 o'clock, the sun's up and they are wanting to head back to camp. Well, between 10 and 2 p.m. is a prime time for you to be out and trying to unravel more parts of the puzzle. You can walk trails, you can scout out new feed areas, be careful with bedding areas, but you can start to piece together where deer might be bedding based on food sources, water, and trail systems. And then you've got more intelligence going into the evening hunt and where you might set up. And what often makes the difference between those who fill their tags and those who don't is how much effort you're willing to put into it to go into that drainage that no one else wants to go into, or drop into that thicket that nobody else is dropping into. Those are the kinds of places that deer tend to hang out, especially mature deer. They're not going to be out in the open hillsides. And so it's really a matter of how much effort you want to put into it. And of course you want to keep safety in mind and all of those things. But if you utilize that midday, 4 or 5 hours in the middle of the day to do some in-season scouting, you can optimize your hunt even when you're on a limited time budget. Okay, so you hear a lot about the rut. What is the rut? The rut is basically the breeding ritual that all big game animals go through. And for deer, that usually kicks off, in my opinion, once they lose their velvet off their antlers, usually at the end of August, early September. And you might be saying, well, wait a minute, that's not the mating season. It isn't the mating season. But that's the beginning of it, because now you've got another age class of deer with a new set of headgear and a new attitude to go with that. So what happens in October is a lot of pecking order work amongst the deer herd. So you'll have all these bucks running around trying to figure out who's who's the top dog, and basically this amounts to a lot of activity leading up to the breeding period, which typically is in November. Deer that are not bred in November will come back into estrus around 28 days later, so you'll get a second rut that often happens in December. There's a lot to unpack there, too much to go into in this video, but in terms of our October seasons, think about pecking order. November seasons, think about breeding cycles and basically the peak of the rut. So that mid-November time frame, you're going to see a lot of daytime activity with bucks. You're going to see a lot of mature bucks that you didn't know existed stepping out into the daylight for the first time. So keep that in mind. As you get into December, especially in our late archery seasons, we've got some units that allow a very generous late archery season. Obviously we have short days, so your length of hunting time in December is not very long each day, but you are able to get out there and put in some time and capitalize on that second rut, which usually happens around the middle of December. And I've utilized rattling and calling and different strategies on blacktails to fill my tag late in the year. So here's something you want to look for. If you're elk hunting and you're trying to locate elk, now this is a really old rub, but this is definitely made by an elk. And if you look, there's scarring all over this bark. I would say given the age of this rub, it's probably maybe 5 or 6 years old, could be a little older. But what an old rub can tell you is where that species was during the mating season. So in this particular case, this tips me off that there was a bull in here during September rutting. So I'm going to probably log this spot, look for other rubs, maybe look for fresher rubs to indicate that animals are currently using it. But I'll move the camera here in a minute. One thing that is a surefire sign that they are currently using that is that I'm looking at this thimbleberry and it's all grazed down by elk. And I know that because elk love these leaves, and they will pick off not the stem of the leaf, they'll pick off the very end of the leaf. And what that leaves is a stalk that looks like this. And if you look closely here, they've left the stem of each leaf, but they plucked the leaf off. This whole area is cleaned out. So the point here is, these are the kinds of clues you want to look for when you're out in the woods. I'm currently looking for some spots to hang a deer stand for late blacktail season. So, but this is still information that I'm going to log because that tells me that there are elk using this area as well. Well, let's talk about elk hunting for a few minutes. So we're fortunate in Washington because we have the Roosevelt elk subspecies that lives on the west side of the state out to the coast, and on the east side of the state we have Rocky Mountain elk. That provides Washingtonians a great opportunity to hunt two different subspecies of elk, all within our state. In early October, a lot of bulls are still very interested in breeding while the cows are not receptive. So sometimes what you can do is use a locator bugle to try to locate these bulls that are still kind of fired up, and oftentimes they'll respond, tipping off their location. I tend to have the best luck doing this at night, driving roads, bugling, and then listening carefully and trying to pinpoint on a map where I think that bull might be. The next morning I have a place to go and a good starting point. So that's a tip you can try in early October. As we move into November and December, herd dynamics change quite a bit, and this applies to west side and east side elk. Animals go from a breeding phase into a winter herd survival phase of finding quality food and herding up for the winter. And on the east side you have migrations that occur. You have animals moving from higher elevations down into lower elevations where they can find better food, stay out of the colder weather and deep snows. On the west side, animals haven't moved locations too much, but they will focus on bedding areas close to primary food sources. So the name of the game here on both sides of the state is try to locate elk. And sometimes that's driving roads, looking for fresh trails, crossing roads into good feed-aged clear cuts. Usually a cut that's 3 to 5 years old will be perfect feed-age cut. There'll be a lot of new growth in that cut due to the opening that's created by the logging activity, and elk will gravitate to those spots to feed early and late. On the east side, if the weather's colder, I would focus on south-facing slopes that receive a lot more warmth from the sun, especially in late afternoon. If there are early snows, that sun will melt off that thin layer of snow, opening up more feed for elk. So think about south-facing slopes in the November and late seasons in December if you're on the east side. And just a reminder, some other considerations when you're hunting elk in the fall. These are big animals. They cover a lot of ground. So don't be afraid when you're out there hunting to make some noise. Elk make noise. They're very noisy animals in the woods. So until you found fresh sign, cover ground, because you can spend a lot of time creeping around in an area that's void of elk. You're better off to find elk first, then slow down and begin your hunting strategies. Another thing to remember is just the fact that they need food, cover, and water. If you're hunting in areas that don't provide those three things, you need to consider that, look at the maps, and figure out where elk might need to go get those resources. One final tip I'd like to offer is to plan for success. Make sure you've got a solid plan to get that meat broken down and transported home, keeping it cold and clean the whole way. These things take a lot of effort and planning, and don't overlook this important step in the process. Well, we haven't talked about bears and cougars yet. And we're lucky here in Washington because we've got healthy populations of both bears and cougars, and they can both sustain the current levels of regulated hunting, which is good news for big game hunters in the fall. If you're looking to expand your horizons outside of deer and elk, these two species provide an exciting opportunity and some incredible table fare as well. So we'll cover a couple tips here and some safety considerations. One thing to remember about black bears is you can find them early morning, middle of the day, evening. They're out feeding constantly. And one thing they love in the fall is ripe berries. So if you're looking for a midday activity, you can glass logging roads such as the one I'm on now and seek out these big openings where you have a lot of blackberries growing along the road edge. And you can find bears moving along these roads, gorging on these berries. I'll get the camera over here, you can see what I mean. They're perfectly ripe this time of year, and they're very sweet, unlike earlier in the summer where they can be kind of sour. But it's also a great way to get a midday snack if you're out. Other places you can encounter black bears any time of the day would be open hillsides where they can be glassed up, flipping over rocks, eating ants and insects. They'll move into reforested areas and tear up stumps and old logs looking for termites and other sources of protein. Just remember, they're opportunistic and they're just sort of always meandering around in search of food. So if you keep your eyes peeled and get a good quality pair of binoculars, you might glass up a bear middle of the day or just at other low times of the day in your deer and elk hunts. Another tactic that's very productive on predators such as bears and cougars is using predator calls to call them in. And here I want to offer a word of caution here and safety. Whenever you're using a distress animal call to elicit a response from a predator such as a bear or a cougar, you need to be considerate of safety. So there's two ways you can go about this. One is hunt with a partner. Have someone focused on the calling and another person focused on being the shooter. This way you have two sets of eyes that you can scan and listen, just to make sure that you've got, you know, that added coverage. If you're hunting alone, I would highly recommend using a portable tree stand, or maybe a rock outcropping or some other elevated position that offers you more safety being alone. I personally like to be off the ground. That provides an obvious buffer between me and an approaching predator. I have called in bears numerous times. I have not called in a cougar yet to my knowledge. But when you're calling these animals and they're responding to the sound of a distressed calf or fawn, or even another wounded animal, they're coming in with the idea that there's a meal at the end of that. So again, safety. Just a few parting thoughts. Yeah, I grew up hunting Washington since I was a kid. I've lived here most of my life and have enjoyed everything from waterfowl hunting, big game hunting, predator hunting, and of course all the fishing opportunities. But one thing, time is so precious, and it's harder and harder sometimes to carve out the time and make time to go on these adventures. But I would encourage you to, when you're out, to really try to slow down and unplug and really gel with the natural world. It provides so much enrichment and peace of mind, and you can just learn so much by maximizing your time afield each day. Just really try to enjoy it. So hope you learned a few things today. I'm gonna finish my hike out and we'll wrap it up. Well, that's gonna wrap up today's video. I hope you got some tips and tactics that you can take to the field the rest of the fall. We've got 3 months of hunting season left, and just want to wish everyone a great rest of the season. Stay safe, and good luck out there.